All right, really light tonight. That's okay, we'll get started. How's everybody doing? Got a haircut?
Yeah.
All right. All right, so what did we talk about last week?
Computer engineering.
What's that?
Computer engineering.
Computer engineering, yes, we did. What else did we talk about last week?
Biomaterials.
Biomaterials? What else, Thomas?
Binary.
What's that?
Like binary.
Yeah, we talked about binary. Yeah, that's correct. Right, so why do we use binary? Why is binary a thing?
It's easy to keep track of,
It's easy to keep track of, and why is that important from a computer standpoint?
so it can be more accurate and faster.
Right, because then I can use my switch, which is either in what position? On or off, which means it's giving current or not giving current, so it's a 1 or a 0, right? And that's why on sometimes power switches, right, those toggle power switches, it'll actually show a line or a 0, right? That's the whole reason for that. And then we went through biomaterials a bit. We talked about polymers as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce our guest speaker, and then tonight we're going to go through surfactants real quick, because that kind of forms the basis of what else we're going to be talking tonight, which is primarily engineering solutions to cancer. So, hey Darren. So I would like to, without further ado, introduce my sister, Dr. Katie Stowers. So Katie is not an engineer, however, she is a medical doctor who knows way more than I do about this subject that we're talking tonight, so that's why we brought her in. So I want to let her tell you a bit about herself first, and then we'll get going with the lecture.
So hi, I'm Katie Stowers, and I am a physician. I work up at Oregon Health Science University in the Portland VA now. Like Andrew, I'm sure he probably told you, I graduated from Sunset High School many years ago, and I went to undergraduate college at St. Leo University, which is down in Florida. Actually had a softball scholarship to go down there and play, which is what took me down to Florida. And then I did medical school at Nova Southeastern University, which is in Fort Lauderdale. And from there I did my residency and my fellowship at Ohio State University. And now back up here working. I am a palliative care physician, so I got my initial training in internal medicine, and then I did a subspecialty fellowship in palliative care. So I work a lot with cancer patients. Palliative care is for anyone who has a serious illness. Palliative care physicians help with pain and symptom management, and they help with planning for the future with people who have serious illness. So I work a lot with the medical oncologists and collaborate in the care of their oncology patients.
And just to clarify, oncology is cancer.
Cancer,
Yes.
yes. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
How rigorous was your medical school
Super easy, right? No problem.
yeah.
So the first 2 years of medical school, as you may know, are mostly classroom-based, learning kind of the essentials, the basics, and then the last 2 years are clinical, so you actually go into hospitals and clinics and apply what you learned the first 2 years into actually seeing patients. A lot of the medical schools now are trying to kind of mix it up a little bit, where you're seeing a little bit of patient care and doing a little bit of classroom work all at the same time, so it's not, so you can integrate it a little bit better, so it's not so split between book learning and experiential learning. So it's, you learn a lot of anatomy, you have to apply your physics and your chemistry, and you have to pharmacology, and it's a lot of memorization early on in medical school as you're learning all of your drugs and all of your different bacterias and microorganisms and things that cause disease, but it's just school. Yeah.
So some just, we're all about learning everything we can, right? So some may be looking up there and wondering why there's so many things next to your name, right? You got your bachelor's, you got your DO, then you need your residency and your fellowship, right? So for those of us like myself who are limited to Grey's Anatomy of knowing the positions, could you quickly run people through why you do a residency, why you do a fellowship, and then how that turns into a staff position?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first step is medical school, and when you get done with medical school, you're actually not really qualified to do anything at that point, other than having a degree and a lot of knowledge. From there, you actually have to choose a specialty, whether it's surgery or OBGYN, go deliver babies, or take care of children, pediatrics, and so you choose a certain specialty and you go into a residency. Residencies range anywhere from about 3 years to 5, or even if you're doing something like neurosurgery, brain surgery, could be up to like 7 to 9 years of training. And it's at that point then that you are able to take your certifying exams to be able to say that yes, I can practice within this specialty. So really to get to the place where you can actually practice medicine, it takes somewhere around 4 years for your initial medical school, plus about 3 years for a residency training, so somewhere around 7 years to be able to get to the point where you can go open up a clinical practice or go get hired on by a hospital to practice taking care of children or doing brain surgery or something like that. For those folks who want to go on and specialize into something even further, like say you want to be a medical oncologist or a cancer doctor, you would then, after your residency training, do a fellowship training, so another level of subspecialty training. And that could be anywhere from an extra year all the way up to 3 to 5 to more years. So there's some folks who spend a really, really long time in school. Just to give you an example, my course was 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency training, and then an additional year for my palliative care fellowship. So I had 8 years through my medical training, at which point I was able to take my certifying exams and then apply to the state to have a license to practice medicine, and then get hired on by a hospital.
Thank you. All right, any other questions for her while we have her? All right, so while I do, you can say it for a second. So while I do recognize that it's kind of weird, right, for an engineering course for me to bring in a doctor, right? I'm not just showing off my sister, although I'm exceedingly proud of her. The reason that I brought her in specifically for this is that sort of the stuff we're going to be talking about tonight, we very much work as a team, right? So she obviously is in the diagnostic, right? She'll diagnose, she'll say, here's the problem, here are the solutions that we need. She'll take it back to the companies who are designing the drugs, the people doing the research in the universities. Some doctors are involved in research from the very get-go. There are degrees out there called MD PhDs, which is where you get a PhD, and then you are also a certified medical doctor. That is a lot of work and a long time in school. But what it does is it essentially enables you to, for the lack of a better term, practice research at the same time, right? So what we would do, for example, if let's say I worked at like an Abbott or something like that, right, where I'm developing a drug, I would be working with Katie to not only get my trials done, but she would be saying this is not working, or here's what I need, and she'd come back and we would constantly work to each other. So when we go through stuff like we're talking about tonight, it's kind of back to what we talked about material science and engineering, where materials science and engineering kind of is the same thing. There's not really like a science side and an engineering side. When we get into the drug design and drug administration type of, and I should say, be careful saying drug administration, not like FDA type stuff, but I mean, getting it out there and using it properly and making sure that it's doing what we need it to do, that's where engineers and doctors work very closely together, right? They've got the people skills, we're the nerds in the lab, right? We'll come up with the drug and they'll make it work.
Even up at Oregon Health Science University, a lot of the physicians there have labs that are dually run by a PhD and an MD or a DO, and so they're doing a lot of this translational science where they're taking clinical problems and then they're going back and they're working with their engineering and their basic medical science team to come up with solutions to these answers. So
yeah, and this doesn't just work on the drug side either, it works on the robotics, on the devices side. Her husband, as a matter of fact, is actually head of, he's head of robotics or something, right?
He's a general surgeon at the Portland VA, and he does a lot of robotic surgery. So he is know if you guys exactly know what that is, but instead of using your hands to do surgery, you're actually using a machine. So it's kind of like playing a video game. He sits behind a console and moves the arms of a robot to go in and do very fine surgical procedures within the body. Yeah.
What exactly does that accomplish besides if you used that instead of your hands instead?
Why, other than just fun, would you do that? Yeah, absolutely. So with the robot, you're able to take, your hand is yay big, right? So for me to get my hand into the body, I have to have an incision that's pretty large for me to get in, to see what I'm gonna do. The robot allows you to take, things that are about as big as your finger, that has cameras on them, and then tools that can move 360 degrees and stick them into the body. So the incisions that you're left with are pretty tiny. And so recovery times, how long it takes for people to heal after surgeries, are a lot shorter. Pain is less. And so there's a lot of different advantages of doing it through the robot versus the hand, with regards to how people do after surgery, healing and such. Great question.
Yeah. And obviously in situations like that, it's very necessary for him to work with the vendors. A person who usually comes, he was not able to make it this year, his name's Nick. I used to go to school with him. He works for a company called Brain Lab. He is in what they do is they design medical equipment that's used primarily in brain surgery, as their name implies. And they can go in and pinpoint in three-dimensional space using CAT scans exactly where the tumor is, go and extract it. And in order for them to execute the surgery, he's actually, even though he's an engineer, he's not a doctor, he's in the surgery while that's happening. He's essentially a technician to make sure that everything goes correctly, the equipment performs, if there's any troubleshooting that happens, right? So he's an engineer who's physically in the room and helping the doctors who are using the equipment develop the equipment, right? We've talked about that before, right, in developing for customers. Just because something works the way we think it should work doesn't mean that ultimately that's the way it needs to work, right? So if he brings the doctor something and the doctor says this is not gonna cut it, literally, right, then we need to go back and design that. So anyway, that's our little spiel of why tonight it's very important to have someone with Katie's experience in here. So, all right, so real quick, before we get into the cancer part, I want to talk about surfactants. So does anybody know what a surfactant is? Okay. Do oil and water mix?
No.
No. Are you sure?
Wow.
You can make them mix, right? That's what I was looking for. How do I make them mix? Using a surfactant, right? So, we all know that oil and water don't mix, right? The two substances are what we call insoluble. If you were to take water and put in oil, use olive oil or something like that, you put them in together, they'd actually stack on top of each other and they would not mix. If you were to shake them up, you'd form a bunch of little funky looking bubbles. It actually starts to look kind of creamy. But then over time it separates out and you get oil and water again. They're not mixing. So this has to do with differences in molecular polarity, right? Remember what's a polar molecule? Positive on one end and negative on the other side, right? So it has different charges based on the size of its molecule, right? And what do those molecules do? Water is the perfect example. What do those guys do when they're in their natural state? Yeah, they line up accordingly, right? That's why we get hydrogen bonding in water, right? That's why water expands when it freezes, right? Okay? So water molecules, like we just talked about, are polar, but oil molecules are not. So what happens is, it's not that they actually don't like to be next to each other. It's actually that the polar molecules will attract each other, and the non-polar molecules will just kind of get pushed out of the way. So what happens is a natural separation. It's not that the polar molecules say, you ick, I don't like you. What they do is they actually just kind of separate out from each other. Okay? So that's why I want to be very clear. It's an absence of attraction. It's not pushing each other away. Okay? Although oil is seemingly repelled by water, there's in reality no repulsive force between them. Okay? So what this leads us to is the concept of hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So a hydrophile is something that likes water, and a hydrophobe is someone who's scared of water, right? Or something that's scared of water. And where this starts to matter is when we start looking at things on surfaces, right? So a hydrophilic surface, if I were to drop water on a hydrophilic surface, what I'll see is that water droplet will spread out nice and even. If I were to drop it on a hydrophobic surface, what you'll see is that water starts beating up. So you may notice that, like, some of you guys may put like Rain-X on your car windshield or something like that. The idea is to get the water to beat up so that it can quickly move off. There's a company just down the street here who specializes in materials that are hydrophobic. Does anybody know what company that is? Columbia? Why would you want hydrophobic materials on a coat?
Rain jacket.
Rain jacket, yes, exactly correct, right? So they have hydrophobic, they have very tightly wound hydrophobic fabric so that the water will beat up and then rolls right off so that you don't get wet. If you're clothing, like Benjamin's jacket is probably very soakable, right? If you were to get wet right now, he'd gain a lot of weight in his jacket. And that's not what we would want to do if we were out camping and trying to survive, right? All right, so surfactants, though, are these very interesting molecules that actually have both parts. So what they have is they have this very long chain, very long tail is what we call it, that is hydrophobic. So that portion of the molecule looks like oil. Then we have what we call the head, which is on the, well, on one side, but it is hydrophilic, right? So we have a charged molecule on one side, and at the very tail, we have a neutral molecule. But because these molecules are so big in and of themselves, the two ends don't really see each other. So what we have on one end is something that does not like water, and what we have on the other end is something that likes water. So what do you think happens if we put a surfactant at an oil-water interface? What do you think happens? Does everybody know what I mean by an oil-water interface? So let's say I had water, let's say I did that thing before where we mixed water and oil. There's going to be some point in our beaker somewhere where there's a line where above it is oil and below it is water, or vice versa. That's the interface. So if I had a molecule, a surfactant molecule, sitting at that interface, what do we think would happen?
Would both of them like attract to the surfactant?
Yeah, well, it's going to align itself. But yes, you're correct. They're both going to be well, that's actually not entirely, from a nomenclature standpoint, they're not both attracted. The polar side is attracted, and what happens to the tail? It's pushed away. Right, so it's not that the non-polar group's not attracting the tail, it's that the tail's being pushed away from the polar group. Makes sense?
Yeah.
It's essentially the same thing, but it's different in practice, right? Does anybody have any examples of what a surfactant might be? What's that?
Well, maybe not a surfactant, but the polar and non-polar phospholipid.
Phospholipid, exactly. That's exactly where we're going, right? So we're talking about before bio, you nailed it. But the thing you guys use every day, who uses soap?
Yeah.
Right? So, you get in the shower, what's coming out of your shower head? Water. I hope water, right? So it's water, and you have oil on your skin. Is water very effective at getting that oil off your skin? It kind of does mechanically, it can kind of beat it off, but it's not going to absorb the dirts on your skin. So what you do when you take soap is you scrub up in this surfactant, and when you put it on, the non-polar stuff sticks to the dirt, and then when the water drives by, the polar sticks to the water, and then the water takes away the dirt molecule. And that's how soap works to clean you. Right? So soap is the surfactant that we see every single day. All right, so next I have a little diagram here. And I do want to point out real quick that the reason we call them surfactants, it actually comes from surface active agent. And that's because of what we're going to see. So, now let's assume that we have air on top. So we just have a water surface that's just sitting and hanging out. Could be a lake, something like that, maybe in a glass. Let's go ahead and drop in some little surfactants. And that's how we draw them, that's how we represent them. You can get your jokes out if you think they look like something else. That's just the way the nomenclature is, okay? So, once I drop these in, what do we think is going to happen to these guys? Benjamin, help me out here.
The tails will end up in the air, and the hydrophilic head will.
You are exactly correct. So the hydrophilic head will stick in the water, and the tails, the hydrophobic, will be sticking out. But now let me ask you a question. What happens if my surface is completely filled up and I add more? What's going to happen? Let's see. What's going to happen is I'm going to add more, but now these guys, they can't go to the surface. the tails have to be in the water. So what's going to happen is these guys are going to protect themselves. The tails are going to protect themselves by forming into a little ball like that. And this is in 3 dimensions. So now what you have on the outside is you have a ball that is completely okay being in water, but on the inside is essentially an oil environment. And that's actually what happens in soap, is it forms a micelle, this is what this is called, around your little particle, your oil particle, and then the water will help carry it away. Okay? So we call these micelles. So as we can see here, on the inside is oil, or you can have a reverse micelle. It would be if, for example, we had an oil-based solution. And then Benjamin was nailing it right on the head of where we're going for here. Phospholipids are biological molecules. Oops, I can turn back the lights on. All right, watch your eyes. All right, so phospholipids are biological molecules that have dual nature. In fact, they act like surfactants. Okay? So what they have is a hydrophilic phosphate head, and then they have lipid tails. Lipids are essentially fatties, right? And what they form is a cell wall. Or they can form what is a cell wall. Right? So what they'll do in water is they can form a bilayer. So what happens is you have water on the outside, you have a thin layer that is oil, or fatty, or whatever you want to call it, and then on the inside, again, we have now another water-friendly situation. And that's what essentially a cell looks like, right? Your body is water-based. You form these cell walls with your phospholipids, and then on the inside of your cell, it's still water-based. Right, and then just real quick, from a science standpoint, I wanted to throw out something that's really cool you guys may have heard of from a nanotechnology standpoint, which is self-assembly. So surfactants can also be used to synthesize nanomaterials due to their ability to assemble in an ordered pattern. So let's say, for example, I created a surfactant that had like a metal head on it. What's going to happen is if we put it in the right solution, it's going to merge like that. And then, through the proper reaction, we can take the tails away, and what we'll be left with is a copper nanoparticle. We can actually do the same thing to build bigger structures or targeted molecules, where in this case, if we were to do the same thing, you could form a copper nanowire. They'd all align in a line, you dissolve the tails, and then you're left with a nanowire. All right. So at this point, invite Katie back up. Or do we have any questions on surfactants? Right, just wanted to hit that real quick so everyone understood how that works, and how cell walls work. Some of you guys are nodding like you already knew this. Madison's nodding. She guys is down. All right, perfect. So I invite you back up, and let's go through cancers. So who here knows what cancer is? Nobody. Nobody's heard of it? Just Jay Ron. He's the only person who knows what cancer is? I don't believe you guys at all. All right, so can you cure cancer?
Well, yeah, sure, but it's hard.
Yeah, sure, but it's hard.
You can remove.
All right, so before we get into this, I want to make sure everyone understands cancer is not one thing, right? There are, I don't know how many different types of cancers, a lot, right? For someone to say, I'm going to go out and cure cancer, means that person has no chance of curing cancer because they're ignorant, right? You might cure breast cancer, or you might cure prostate cancer, or you might cure some other form, but you're not going to cure cancer on the whole, right? So what is cancer? What is it, Jerome?
When cells start multiplying out of control.
Okay, is that pretty good?
Yeah.
Good. Anybody else? All right. So cancer is a name given to a group of related diseases. And I want to say cancer is not just one disease. But just like Jerome said, cancers are characterized by unregulated cell growth and the invasion of spread of cancerous cells to other sites in the body. And that's when things start going really bad, right? It's highly likely that I have multiple cancerous cells in my body right now, right? I might have a lump somewhere or something like that, but it might not necessarily be bad cancer, and it may not have traveled to other parts of my body, right? And that's when things go bad, and for people is, if you just have one lump, we could go extract that in theory, right? But if it starts spreading to other places in your body, your lymph nodes in particular, that's when, and step in at any time, right?
Yeah.
That's when things go south on you.
So that's called metastasis, and I think you get to that when it spreads from the initial site. But once cancer spreads from its initial site, it pretty much becomes uncurable at that point.
So just to be clear, just our picture here, right? And remember, now imagine these guys have, well, these are cells, right? So these are cell walls. But in the normal pattern, and I realize that it's not going to be completely flat, right? But in our normal pattern, you're going to have regulated cell growth. Cells are going to stop growing when there's too many of them. They're not going to overpopulate. They're going to have some sort of material balance where if one dies, another one will replace it, something like that, right? When something goes wrong within a cell, we can start to get cancers, and that's what we see on the right there with that little red lump, right? Something will happen to the cell, it will mutate in some fashion, and it will start to replicate uncontrolled, right? It doesn't even necessarily mean that that cell itself is bad or harmful, but what starts to become a problem is the growth itself. All right, so you want to take it away for the carcinomas, sarcomas, and adenocarcinomas?
So the different nomenclature that you give to the different types of cancers really just depends on where the cell originated from. So for instance, carcinomas, these arise from the epithelial cells, and this is really kind of our most common types of cancers. Sarcomas, on the other hand, are cancers that arise from like the bone or the muscle tissue. So your carcinomas are going to be things like your lung cancers, your colon cancers, and then you can have a couple different types of cancers even within those carcinomas. So you can have a squamous or an adenocarcinoma depending on the different type of cell that it originates from. And then, like I said, your sarcomas, you'll have different types depending on if it starts in the bone or starts in the muscle. And so you can have, there's so many different types of cancers. Pretty much every cell in your body can end up being cancerous. There are, of course, some cancers that are more common than others. Lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate, colon, those are some of the top cancers that people die from in the United States today. And then skin cancers are incredibly common because they're so visible. We catch them pretty early, and they're not really ones that tend to metastasize. In some cases, melanomas and things can, but generally speaking, most of the skin cancers that we get, people don't necessarily die from except for melanomas. So they're incredibly common, but not necessarily as lethal as things like lung cancer, colon, prostate, breast, some of those cancers.
Thank you.
All right, so causes of cancer, right? Cancer begins when genes which control the cell division and growth are damaged through mutation, right? So just to throw it out there, right? How many times does a cell divide in your body? Does anybody know? I don't actually know the answer to that. The answer is a lot, right? Cells will divide, they'll die, new ones will come, right? That's how cells replicate, right? Every time that happens, there is a very slight statistical chance that something can just naturally go wrong, right? Something could just not line up right, whatever. It could happen, right? That's why you can have people of different ages getting cancer, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a cause, like you might hear, of tobacco smoking or UV radiation or stuff like that. Now that certainly, those factors certainly can encourage things to go wrong on cell replication. But it really just boils down to a game of statistics, right? Every time your cell replicates, there is some infinitely small chance, but still present, that something will go wrong. And that is, by and by, why the longer you live, the more likely you are to get cancer, is because you've had more and more and more cell divisions. Plus, obviously, other things can impact that, such as X-rays, UV radiation, anything like that, right? That could make a cell division go wonky, or we could actually damage a cell in some way, preventing it from actually replicating in the proper way. So, these mutated genes then cause cells to grow and divide uncontrollably. This causes rapid growth and destruction of neighboring healthy cells. So, would you mind talking about gene P53?
Yeah, so I'm going to add on to what Andrew said. So one mutation is not necessarily a bad thing. Mutations, as our cells replicate, happen all the time. The body has mechanisms that it's supposed to go through and check for those mutations, and if it finds one, it's supposed to kill the cell. Through a lot of different mechanisms. A lot of cells have their own kind of internal kill switch, to where if it notices that it has a pretty bad mutation, it'll go through a process called apoptosis, which is basically programmed cell death, and it'll just kill itself. What happens is when that mutation is missed, and then that cell splits into 2 daughter cells. And so now that mutation then becomes part of the bigger picture. And then if a second mutation happens on top of that one, and then maybe a third mutation happens on top, that's where the part when we get into this cascade of continual mutations, and that's what causes cancer to happen. And so, as I said, kind of with this checks and balances within the cell, the cell has its own internal drive to either replicate or to not. And so you have things that are called oncogenes or proto-oncogenes. Do you talk about this at all?
No.
Okay, so you have these genes within the cell that tell the cell, I'm gonna divide or I'm not. I'm gonna stay as my own solid cell. And so think about it like the gas pedal. So you have a proto-oncogene, which is basically your foot on the gas pedal. It's telling the cell, go ahead and divide. So maybe you had a cut on your arm and you need to repair that skin. Proto-oncogene, foot on the gas pedal, your skin cells are gonna replicate to heal that wound that you have on your arm. As the scar forms and you don't need to do that anymore, then you're gonna have something that slows it down, and that's gonna be your foot on the gas pedal. What happens in cancer, the most common cause in cancer is that these 2 genes get either turned off or turned on. So your proto-oncogene, which is your foot on the gas pedal, it gets flipped on into an on position all the time. Then it becomes what we call an oncogene, and that just creates rapid cell proliferation, continual splitting of the cells. Or the opposite thing could happen, your suppressor gene, which is supposed to slow cell replication, gets turned off. So you can't actually put your foot on the gas pedal, and the gas pedal gets stuck in the on position and continues to replicate. So gene P53 is a proto-oncogene. It is foot on the gas pedal. And so what happens is you get an abnormality there where it gets stuck in the on position. And so cells just continue to replicate. This gene is one of the causative factors in about over 50% of our cancer. So this is a very common cause of cancer. Yeah?
Okay, so like, this is a basic question, but like when the cells like start to become too much in like a certain area, how does that like specifically like damage the body?
How does it do what? I'm sorry?
Like how does it like when it becomes like too much of like a certain cell, like when a tumor becomes too large, how does that like actually damage the organ?
Okay, great question. So I think the liver is probably the easiest example. So the liver in your body, it does a couple of different things, but basically the liver is the filter for your body. So it takes all of your toxins and it filters them through to clean you out and to keep your body healthy. So what happens if you get tumors in your liver, it actually replaces the healthy tissue, which is doing the filtering, with tumor cells that don't do the filtering. And once the burden of tumor gets so great that it replaces all of the healthy tissue with the tumor tissue, the liver can't actually do the function that it was intended to. So all of the toxins start to build up in your body and you can't actually function anymore. Does that make sense? So you're replacing healthy tissue with abnormal tissue that can't do the function it was intended. Yeah.
So, 2 things.
Okay.
So, does it break its original function and just try and go on its own path? That's like, would that be what a cancer cell does?
Yeah, so they're no longer, in most cases, performing their original function.
Okay.
Right. And do remember, these things are still alive, they're still absorbing nutrients, they might actually be more aggressively absorbing nutrients and choking out its neighbors, right?
Yep.
Okay, and what happens if that suppressor gene, if it's reversed, if the other thing, if the, what's that thing, the gene like the P53 is turned off, but the suppressor is constantly on or something?
That would be something like a leukemia where you can't heal as well. Is that accurate?
Well, if the suppressor gene was turned on all the time and you wouldn't replicate, that's interesting. I don't know, I can't think right now of what a I can't think of what pathologic process would happen if that were to happen, but basically you just wouldn't replicate cells. My guess would be that would be incompatible with life, would be my guess.
So that specific cell would just die later after it was created.
Exactly, and not, right, because it wouldn't be able to replicate. So I think if you had a bunch of those cells, that would never get out of embryogenesis. I mean, that person probably would never be born. And if that mutation happened later on in life, that cell would never replicate to propagate that mutation from continuing on.
So I know animals get cancer. Do you know if plants get cancer? Like,
I suppose it could happen.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
kind of related question. What if like we eat like meat with cancer? I guess like a tumor. If we eat tumor.
Because we absorb the nutrients from the food we eat and not necessarily like the cells and things. I mean, my guess is they would not get incorporated into our own genetic material. The food that we eat doesn't get incorporated into our genetic material, and so it would not, I think we would basically just probably poop it out.
So let's keep moving. But so fundamentally, what happens, right, is because of these mutations that she was describing, what happens is that old cells that should have died are still around, and new cells form when they're not needed. Those are the two fundamental problem statements.
Yep.
Okay, so mutations, right? We already talked about mutations. So this can just happen just by statistical chance and DNA replication, but it can also be damaged by carcinogens, right? You guys have been told probably multiple times a year since you've been in school that smoking is bad, okay, right? So don't do that. Obviously, wear your sunscreen. And then viruses like HPV. There's also obviously inheritance, right? Some families, some lines are more prone to certain types of diseases and cancers than others. And then obviously, right, especially like breast cancer is very common that runs in families. Right, so spreading of cancers. Extra cells divide without stopping, and form tumors. And then once a cell is turned cancerous, it divides until it forms a tumor. And as a malignant tumor, and that's where it's become malignant, is the definition is that it's killing, right? Or it's harmful.
Yeah.
Yeah, harmful. So as a malignant tumor progresses, clumps can break off and then metastasize, as she already talked about, move to other parts of the body, which makes it very difficult to treat.
Moves through your lymphatic system and your bloodstream.
All right, so we want to talk about, yes, go ahead.
So with those chunks that break off, how do those bond again to the body? Why don't they just float around for a bit or something?
That is a great question that I don't have a great answer to.
Okay.
Probably just get stuck, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that just cause like a heart attack or something if that was the case?
I don't have a great, except when they break, I mean, you're talking very, very tiny little things that'll go off and seed other places, and then they'll start to replicate there. So it's not like you've got these big chunks that are moving through your bloodstream, right? You'll have one cell that'll kind of invade into, as the tumor is growing, it'll invade into a local blood vessel or a local lymphatic chain, and then one little cell will pop in and float someplace else and get planted, and then it'll start growing a new tumor there. Is kind of what happens. So it's like microscopic spread, tiny little cells that float throughout the body. I don't understand all of the specifics of it.
Okay.
All right, so first we want to talk about, before we get into our engineering application, we want to talk about conventional cancer treatment. The first and simplest way is you go in and you cut it out, right? And then again, that's why Nick, who used to come in, like I said, they have a three-dimensional system. They can sit you down if you have a brain tumor. They'll clamp you in so you can't move. And they've determined the exact XYZ coordinates that your cancer tumor is, and they can go in and they can biopsy that exactly, or they can extract it based on what type of equipment they have, right? It's very cool.
This is the best case scenario. This means that your tumor is small enough, localized enough, not hitting important enough things that you can actually go in and scoop it out. This is typically the way that you get a cure from cancer, is through surgical removal.
All right, the next one, and I want to talk a bit about this in depth. So radiation therapy, you guys have all heard about this, right? Radiation therapy uses radiation to kill the malignant cells. It can be very successful if they're located in a specific region, right? So again, once it's metastasized, this is not generally a great option. You have to, at that point, start moving on to something like a chemo, right? What the radiation does, and let's just go ahead and skip forward, right? So what the radiation does is it literally kills the cell. The problem is that the other cells in your body are just as likely to get killed by that radiation. So what they've done, or what they've developed over the years, is they don't simply put Madison down and just shoot her whole body, because then Madison's toast, right? What they do is they'll sit you in, do they use more than 3 beams, I would assume?
Oh yeah, they've got some now that are
Yeah.
multiple, yeah.
So think about it this way, right? We all know that, right, from our chemistry background, we all know that for a reaction to happen, there has to be an activation energy, right? You have to get over a certain amount of energy before you can feel that something's hot, or before it will catch fire, before it will burn your cell, or whatever, right? So what they do is something very cool. So they shoot a laser, right? Let's say we shoot a laser at Madison. That laser itself is not enough to burn Madison up. Okay? But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shoot another laser of the same intensity at Madison as well. Now this laser is passing through JRAM. The JRAM's fine, but now Madison's starting to get hot because now she has 2 lasers concentrated on her in a spot. And now let's say we have a third one now that goes through Thomas. Thomas is fine, JRAM's fine, but as soon as Madison gets that 3rd laser on her, she goes up in smoke. Right? Thank you for being her guinea pig. Right? But that's fundamentally exactly what they do, right? So each stream of radiation itself is not enough to do significant damage or harm to the patient. But combined, knowing exactly where in 3D space that tumor is, they can line it up and they can shoot that tumor and they can kill that tumor and some amount of area around it that's not going to kill the patient itself. Right? Does that make sense to everybody? Right. It's actually very cool how they do that.
It is very cool. They're getting very, very targeted with how they're able to do radiation treatment. So they're able to take, I'm assuming this is much like what maybe Nick is able to do, your friend, but they're able to take tumors that are deep in the brain and line up very focal pinpoint beams of radiation to hit a very small spot, very deep within a lot of other precious areas. If you would have had radiation, like say your parents would have had radiation back when they were kids, that at that time you would get like full fields of radiation. So there was a very common radiation that was done for a particular type of lymphoma that was curative. So it would cure people, but they would get radiated from like here to here. And now we know that as these people who had that treatment as kids are growing up, because radiation is also, it can cause cancer, these folks are getting secondary cancers on top of it because we weren't able to pinpoint our treatments as well.
Yeah, and I'll hit your question in a second. And then there's another problem in that, what if that cancer cell becomes more robust than a normal cell, right? Well, so let's say it requires an extra activation energy. Now you can't kill it. What you're counting on in that type of situation where you're just exposing the target to radiation is you're hoping that that cell will die before the normal cells will, right? And that's not always the case because there are certain cancers that will actually become more robust. What was your question?
How do they use the radiation? Do they like make an incision in a certain place and then?
No, it's essentially guns. Think of it as sitting in a chamber where they, I mean, it's not a gun like a bullet, right? But like it's no different than, I mean, think about it as if you went to the dentist and they used like the X-ray thing they have at the dentist, only way more cool and way higher power.
So they actually call it external beam radiation, the typical radiation that you talk about. So folks will go in and for like certain head and neck cancers or brain cancers, they'll actually get their whole head put in a mask, and then the beams of radiation will come at them externally. Now for certain prostate cancers, which remember your prostate is up inside of you, down in your pelvis, they actually can go plant radioactive seeds up within your prostate where the radiation comes from within and basically burns you from the inside out. So there's a couple different ways that the radiation can be given, but the most common way is what Andrew's talking about, which is the external beam radiation, where it's coming from an external source.
So that when you say you're focusing it on a certain point, does that mean each one is coming from a different angle?
Correct.
They're never on like the same.
Yeah, because think about it, if I was shooting you with, if the two lasers were exactly on top of each other, it'd be twice the intensity,
Yeah.
right? So this is actually very similar to like very high-tech 3D printers actually work in the same fashion, right? You have two lasers and the one, so you have the 3D printers you guys have played with are usually I think the ones where they melt it and then the little robot goes around, right? There's also a type of 3D printer that's a packed bed, so you just throw a whole bunch of polymer in there. And what happens is one laser is enough, one laser is not enough to cause the polymerization reaction. But when you get the two lasers in exactly one spot, it'll cause a polymerization reaction and it will polymerize in exactly that position, right? So what you do is by moving these two lasers around in exactly the right point, you can form a very complicated structure that you wouldn't normally be able to do with your moving printing one, right? You can form like porous structures. We do a lot of that with like catalyst type work. Right? And it's fundamentally the same idea, right? So by moving your lasers in different, and again, in this they're using, usually 3D printers will actually only use two lasers in this case. They might be using 3 or maybe even more. Right, because the whole idea is to kill that one location and only that location, right? And the only way you can do that is by getting your XYZ coordinates lined up on all of them.
Because remember, you're killing the healthy tissues that are there too, and so people who get radiation, they get a lot of extra side effects from the radiation treatment. Folks that have head and neck cancer, so maybe cancer of your tongue or of your voice box, they'll get radiation to kind of this whole head and neck area. Their mouths get ulcers in them, start peeling, they get really bad sore throat, they get skin rashes because it's killing all of the healthy cells in addition to the cancer cells.
All right, and then kind of I think the super negative one that you don't want to have to get to, but kind of the one of last resort is chemotherapy. I'm sure you guys have all heard of that.
It's kind of the workhorse of cancer
Yeah,
treatment.
right. And basically, for lack of a better term, what we do is we inject the body with poison that is designed to hopefully kill the cancer cells faster than it kills the rest of you, right?
It is targeting cells that replicate, okay, which is cancer cells, right? But we have lots of cells that replicate in our body. So the most common side effects are cells that replicate the fastest. So you get a lot of skin side effects, you get a lot of hair side effects, because those are some of your cells that replicate the fastest.
Would it affect the nails in that case?
It can. All the different types of chemo have very different side effects. You get a lot of oral ulcers, people's hair will fall out, you get a lot of skin reactions and things. Your stomach lining, it replaces itself a lot, so there's a lot of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea that happen with these cancers.
So that would also be why chemo patients are usually more susceptible to infections because of immune. Those cells are not being replaced?
Different types of chemos attack different sorts of things. Some do because your blood cells replicate. They also do suppress the production of either your red cells or your infection fighting cells, and those are why you're more susceptible to infections, absolutely.
So even though chemo, we're making it sound, and I think it is, it's one of the least desirable options, chemo is actually where the majority of the technology or where the majority of the advancements are coming from, right? Because what we can do is, there's not just like, it's not like you go in the back and you like take a vial of mercury, right? It's not the way it works, right? So what we're doing is we're trying to develop drugs, we're in the process of developing better drugs that can more specifically target exactly what we want it to target. So these next generation drugs really exploit our knowledge of what happens within cancerous cells. So this is Gleevec.
Yeah, Gleevec is one of the coolest medications, and it really is the best example of where cancer therapy is going. So the Gleevec is used to treat most commonly a blood disorder, chronic myelogenous leukemia, which 50, 60 some years ago was pretty much fatal. And then they discovered that through so what happens with CML, chronic myelogenous leukemia, it's actually where pieces of the chromosome actually flip on themselves. They break off and then they switch. And the new chromosome alignment, the way the genes are aligned on the chromosome once it's reattached, creates this basically proto-oncogene sort of situation that causes CML to happen. So they were able to go find this and target this specific gene abnormality with Gleevec. And so it's very targeted. Now this disease that was killing basically everyone, pretty much everyone who has this specific gene rearrangement, which about 90% of people with CML have, now are surviving and living. It's pretty remarkable.
And then this next one so she helped me prepare this presentation, so she knows a lot more.
You know,
about
I'm
this.
actually not, this one I had to look up. I'm not actually
Oh, okay.
familiar with it. I think it's one that's in clinical trials still.
Okay, one
It's
of the more new ones.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, but so what the whole point here is these specific ones, right, it's not, again, that we're not just going in and injecting you with some random poison, right? What we're doing is we're developing specifically targeted poisons, for lack of a better term, that will go and attack the problem cells and leave the good cells alone, right? Most of the time what they do this is they actually attack the protein within the cell that tells it to replicate, right? So it's not that it's going in there necessarily and killing that cell itself, but it turns off that cell's ability to make new cells. Right. And then next is immunotherapy. So an alternate pathway to chemotherapy, but really fundamentally administered in the same method, right? Is to persuade the immune system itself to attack the bad cells.
And they're doing this in a couple
No, go ahead, yeah.
ways. This is the newest and the latest in cancer treatment is the immunotherapy. And so one of the types is called a checkpoint inhibitor medication. And basically your cells, let me take a step back. The whole purpose of this is to say our immune system does this every day, right? It gets viruses, bacteria, it's looking for foreign invaders into the body, and it's destroying them and killing them and stopping them from replicating. What cancer does is it overpowers the immune system by hiding from it. And so these medications are designed, or these treatments are designed to try to overcome that the cancer has hidden. So let me explain that to you in a different way. So one type of these treatments is called a checkpoint inhibitor treatment. And so what happens is, normally in your immune system, you've got your normal cells that are just roaming around your body, and all of a sudden a virus comes in. So let's say the common cold virus comes in, it infects a cell, and your cell says, hey, this isn't supposed to be here. And so it chews it up and it takes a piece of that virus and it holds it out like a flag on the top of its cell. A T cell, which is one of your immune cells, comes around looking for those flags. And it says, oh, this is abnormal. It takes the flag and it takes it to another different type of T cell that's called like a killer T cell that then will get the immune system up and running, come and attack that cell that's abnormal. So that's normally how your body gets rid of infections and things that happen. Cancer basically keeps the flag that's hidden out. It will come and throw a blanket over it so your immune system can't see it, okay? It'll hide it from your immune system so that it can continue to replicate without the immune response happening. And so what happens is these drugs have been developed to basically bind to your healthy cells before the cancer can, or actually to replace basically the blanket that the cancer has put over it. Basically takes the blanket off so that your body can then respond to that. We jokingly joke, we're nerds too in medicine, okay? You guys aren't the only nerds, engineers, we're nerds too in medicine. We joke that these immune medications unleash, okay? You unleash your immune system, and this is how they go fight. The problem is that when you take the cloak off, you're not just ramping up the immune system to attack cancer cells, you can actually attack healthy cells as well. When your immune system gets revved up, certain autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or what would be another common one that you guys might know, some of the inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's disease and things are actually diseases where the body's immune system is too revved up and it's attacking healthy cells. So that can be one of the side effects of these immune treatments, is not only does the body start attacking the cancer cells, it can start attacking the healthy cells as well. Yeah.
I heard about this by reading it, but there was this polio thing that was used. Is that what was used as a checkpoint one?
So that's vaccine treatment, and that is another kind of emerging strategy where basically they are taking tumor and they're inactivating it, but basically keeping the core proteins of it and injecting it into your body so that the immune system can see it, get revved up against it, and then attack. Much like you use the flu vaccine, right? That's killed flu vaccine that gets injected into you to incite immune response so your body remembers it. Then when you actually see the flu during the flu season, the body attacks it before it replicates enough to actually cause the flu in your system. It's trying to do something similar with cancer. That hasn't worked as well in theory, in practice, as it does in the lab. The other type of really cool thing that they're doing right now with immune treatments is something called CAR-T therapy, C-A-R-T. Basically what they're doing is they're taking your own T cells out of your body and then they're modifying them in the lab to put a little bit of basically cancer cell on top of it, and then it puts it back into your body so then your own immune system can attack. This has shown some really awesome advances in certain cancers, especially for like pediatric young kids, with like lymphomas and leukemias. The problem is that it's really early stages right now and there seems to be a lot of complications, so we're really only using it for kind of very end stage cancers that haven't responded to other treatments, but this is kind of one of the other emerging frontiers of how we're using immune therapies to battle cancer.
Right, any questions on that?
Yeah. Either or. Go ahead.
So like when you take like a drug or whatever, would you have to ingest it or do they have to inject it directly onto the tumor?
Great question. So these medicines are all either in a pill form or they are injected. So it still is a systemic administration, a whole body administration. It's just that they're becoming more targeted on where they're attacking once they get into the body. And I think that's what Andrew's going to go into a little bit more. So you kind of set us up for the next stage on how we actually get those drugs to where we want them to go.
Yep. And you had a question too?
Oh, my question was answered.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so basically what we've already started talking down the path of we're developing things that can specifically target stuff, right? But yes, Thomas.
So one more question. So, like you say, like the cancer in the body and the immune system sometimes like can't find it, like after it just repeat like growing. But like why do the immune system just like can't find the extra like cancer inside?
How come sometimes it can't find the cancer?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's part of the overall problem statement, is that sometimes these specific drugs are either too specific or they're not effective enough, right? Does that answer your question?
The cancer changes, and so go back to our Gleevec example for CML. It works great when you have that particular genetic mutation, but the cancer is constantly continuing to mutate. Remember, every time you replicate, you have a chance for mutation, and cancer is replicating constantly, so there's a lot of mutations that are happening. So the problem is that it may work for that particular mutation, but as the cancer continues to grow, the mutations are happening that it may not actually be effective on. So then you're basically self-selecting for this resistant type of cancer.
All right, so yeah, like we're talking about, so a lot of these methods are inefficient a lot of them are highly inefficient because they just kind of bulk kill, or as we've started to specifically target, they become not efficient enough, right, or not effective enough, right? So, and then of course the side effects of a lot of these, as we talked about, is if they are not administered perfectly, or if it doesn't line up perfectly, it can actually end up doing harm to the patient, right? You can blow your immunotherapy out and start causing other issues, right? So, ultimately, we still need I mean, there's a reason that we're putting a ton of money into cancer research every single day, right? And that's because we still need better, safer, and more effective methods. And that's kind of what we want to talk about tonight, is kind of the next step and where the cutting edge and the stuff that if you guys go into this field, the stuff that you guys will be pushing in your PhD programs, in your graduate research, in your own careers, right? So the first thing we can do is improve drug delivery. Right, this is where a ton of the work, especially on like the chemical and biomolecular engineering side is on improving actually how to get the drug to where it needs to go. Right, so in traditional oral delivery, right, you take a pill and it gets just kind of dispersed throughout the body. Right, what might be a couple problems with that? Madison, what might be a problem with that method?
It might reach the parts that it's not in.
Yeah, but it might not reach the parts it's in, or in order to get it, one of the bigger problems is in order to get it in high enough concentration to where we want it to go, you might have to overload a lot of parts that can't handle that concentration. Right? Yes, ma'am?
Would it also attack the healthy cells?
It absolutely potentially could. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Right? So tumor-specific targeted drug delivery leads to an accumulation in the tumor region and decreases its presence elsewhere. Right, so basically what we're saying is if we can specifically, say we know where our tumor is, and we want to specifically deliver a drug to that tumor, that is the ideal situation, right? Let's say we have a submarine that we can put into our body that can drive exactly where we need it to go and nuke that cell. That would be our perfect killer, our hunter killer for cancer. That would be the perfect situation. And what we're trying to do with targeted drug delivery is do that. So it's not just about coming up with a perfect anti-cancer drug. A lot of it is also about the delivery. And again, that's why the majority of the, or not, I shouldn't say the majority of research, that's why a huge amount of research has been going into drug delivery as well, is getting that drug exactly where we need it to get it to go. Okay, so the question is, how do we get the drugs to where we need them? And this is where we go back to that's why we were talking about nanoparticles last week, right? Nanoparticles as a drug delivery system is perhaps one of the most promising tools that we've been looking at, right? This was actually a fair amount of my graduate research was in sort of this type, is in functionalizing nanoparticles, right? If you can put the words cancer and nano in a grant these days, you're looking pretty good for getting that grant, right? So what they want to do is deliver drugs into the tumor cell with minimum leakage. So what we can do is embed, in this case, the drugs are these little orange dots here, right? So we can put the drug inside of a liposome. We can also form a micelle with that drug inside. Or we can form soluble nanoparticles, meaning that it would go into your body, it would go to a specific spot, and then just like taking a pill, right? Taking like a liquid gel, you take a liquid gel, the outside dissolves, and then the drug is released in your stomach, right? Very similar type idea with the soluble nanoparticles. You drive it exactly where it wants to go, it dissolves, and then boom, you get a bunch of chemotherapy or targeted drug delivery in the area that you want it. The question is, if I'm looking at this, how do I get these guys to go where I want them to go? Any ideas? Okay, fair enough. Alright, so the next thing is a ligand. A ligand is a small molecule that binds to a larger molecule. So now if I look at this, so let's assume that blue dot, let's go back one page. Let's assume that blue dot is my liposome, right? My liposome here has the drug inside of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify the surface of that. I'm going to modify the surface of that with something that wants to go attach to my cancer cell. So let's say we have, the cancer cells want to stick together. Let's say maybe we even stick like a cancer cell right on top of that surface. So it drives exactly, you put it in your body, it goes and it drives, it accumulates exactly by those cancer cells, hits it, opens up, and delivers the drug payload. So targeted cancer therapy is conjugation of nanoparticles with cancer-specific tumor biomarkers is an effective way of getting it to where we want it to go. And that's just what I said. It's active targeting, right? We're saying, I want to modify my drug to be exactly compatible with whatever Benjamin's cancer is, so it'll drive in, it will kill Benjamin's cancer and not anything else, right? Just his cancer cells. So for example, what we might do is we have our nanoparticle in system. We've specifically targeted those little strings, or the ligands on top, to be compatible. It's going to go interact with the cell wall. It's going to be compatible with that cell wall. The cell's gonna say, this looks good. It's gonna take it inside and eat it, and once it's inside, what's it gonna do? What's that? Yeah, it's gonna dissolve and release the drug payload. And then all of a sudden you now have a drug payload being released literally inside of the cell itself. All that's dying is that cell and nothing else. And that's pretty amazing. Okay? So it's smart drug delivery, right? Targeted cancer therapy, when done correctly, can discriminate the small differences between normal and cancer cells. Nanoparticles are loaded with drugs and then delivered to specific parts of the body. Targeted delivery increases the concentration of the drug where it's needed and decreases it where it's not. Drug-loaded nanoparticles have a huge advantage over conventional drugs. The question is now, how do we develop these smart delivery systems? Right? There's a reason I'm not telling you specifically exactly how we're going to do each one of these, because the answer is we don't know yet. Right? These are stuff that we've been doing. One of the scary prospects of trying to do targeted drug delivery is that you would have to tailor each drug delivery, or you'd have to tailor each delivery method based on each individual person's cancer, right? There's been a lot of work of putting actual DNA on these surfaces, so it'll actually specifically drive there. The problem is, that means that each time any certain individual gets cancer, you might have to specifically tailor it to that particular individual. That takes time, that takes money, and that's exceedingly prohibitive. So what we need to do is develop something that's better, more efficient, and more generic. Okay, so we need more research, we need better methods, and the answer is, we need better ideas, and we need top engineering. We need you guys. Right? We need you guys to go out and figure this out, because Katie and I, we're out to pasture, right? Our time's done, right? We need you guys to go do this in grad school and get out and do it. So do we have any questions on anything we talked about tonight? There was a lot of good questions as we went. Very good job. Nothing else? Okay. So we are at 7:37, so we have a little bit left. I want to run through drug delivery itself real quick, and Katie can help me with anything that I miss on this as well. So you guys all know what drugs are. We've already talked about it for quite a bit. It's estimated that 95% of everyone in the US takes at least one type of pharmaceutical drug on a daily or weekly basis. That's actually a mind-blowing number, but I've pulled it from multiple sources and it seems to be very correct. So despite the benefits, drug therapy is only effective if it's administered to the patient correctly. All right, no surprise there. If you're not taking your medication correctly, it's probably not going to help you. Okay? The ultimate aim of drug delivery is to achieve the desired effect without hurting you. For example, Tylenol. Tylenol says on the back, only takes so much within a given period. Why is that? Why is that?
Because it could potentially be harmful if you take too much.
Okay, yeah. So the active ingredient in Tylenol, which is acetaminophen, is a pain reliever and fever reducer. However, in too high concentrations can cause liver damage. Right? So while you may have a really bad headache and you may want to down that whole bottle, that's probably not going to help you in the long run. Right? So it doesn't matter how good a drug is, if we're not taking it in a high enough concentration, it's not going to do anything. And now a lot of times if we're taking these drugs, no matter how benign they may seem, like something like Tylenol, if you take it in too high of a concentration, it can hurt you. So what this leads to is what we call the therapeutic window. The therapeutic window is just defined very simply by the minimum effective concentration of drug in the body and the maximum effective concentration of drug in the body, or essentially the minimum harmful concentration, right? So what we get to is proper dosing will fall within this window, and it just looks like this. Your drug concentration over time in the body, and by time I mean the time that it's been in your body, right? Days, weeks, whatever, needs to stay between the minimum and the maximum. So the question from an engineering perspective is how much and how often, right? For those of you who are here for our night talking about material balances, this is effectively a material balances problem, right? What goes in, what goes out, what stays in, what's consumed, right? And in this case, because it's in your body, and your body is literally using up, right? When we were doing our materials balances, we didn't look at anything with generation or consumption because we wanted to look at a simple case. In your body, obviously, that drug is being used up. So it's not just that you pee it out, it's not just that you poop it out, it's not that you sweat it out, it's that it's also being used up by doing what it's supposed to be doing. Or a lot of these drugs also may have half-lives, right? You guys have heard that term before, right? Where they actually start just breaking down on their own. Okay? So this is an entire field called pharmacokinetics. There's people who literally spend their entire career figuring out, and it's actually a very cool field, right? You think about it. You have to figure out how often you should take that pill. How big does that pill need to be? How fast does that pill need to dissolve? Or any other drug delivery you have to do it, right? So it's the study of movement of drugs into, within, and out of the body. And the goal is to figure out what the best way is to administer a drug. Okay? Plus, you have to be very flexible with it, right? Someone like Katie may determine that her patient needs 500 milligrams per day of it, right? Not every patient needs 500 milligrams per day. Maybe some other patient needs 300 based on their weight, based on their gender, based on their age, right? So you have to be able to, a pharmacokineticist has to be able to analyze and give the information to the doctor so that the doctor can make the correct diagnosis, or prescription, sorry.
I don't know if you guys have had an antibiotic or take any prescription medicine, but when you get the medicine from the pharmacist.
Don't do my thunder.
Oh, okay, sorry.
We're almost right there.
Okay, sorry.
All right. We'll go back to that though. All right, so pharmacokinetics, right, like we talked about, is just material balance, right? Drug in, drug consumed, and then drug out. And you guys should remember this, right? I know you guys are sick of looking at my equations on the board. Don't worry, it's the last lecture of the year. So, rate of drug input minus drug output minus consumption equals rate of accumulation. What's the problem if we have too much accumulation? You kill your liver, right? That's no good, okay? So it all really comes down to dosing, okay? So everybody here's taking antibiotics, right?
Sure.
What do you do on the first day? You get your little packet of antibiotics. What does it have on the first day?
Number.
What's that?
Like how much you use?
Yeah, well, so I remember the ones I get, usually it comes like in a little card.
The little Z-pack.
Yeah, it comes in like a little, it almost looks like the worst birthday card ever, right? So you open it up, and on day 1, there's 2 pills in there. And on day 2, there's 1 pill, and on day 3, there's 1 pill, and on day 4, there's 1 pill, and 5, there's 1 pill, or something like that, right? Why are there 2 on the first day? Why might I want to take 2 on the first day and only 1 thereafter?
Wrap your body.
What'd you say? You said to let it accumulate? Yeah, you have to spike, right? You have to spike up and get your concentration up to where it needs to be originally, right? So you have to on the original dose, you have to get your body up in that window, and then all we need to do from then on is sustain, right? If we're taking it at the correct dosage, right? So what we want to find is, well, hold on. So what you don't want is you don't want to put the pill in your body, completely use it up, and then put the pill in your body, completely use it up. What you want to do is you want to kick it up, and you want it to get it to bounce around inside of that window. Okay, was that effectively what you were going to say? Or good, you can go ahead and do your thing now. I just didn't want you to steal my antibiotics.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say, like, if you ever get when the pharmacist hands you the medication, it typically comes in a bag, and then you've got your little pill box, and then you've got like a pound worth of paper that's all the different side effects and dosing instructions. That's basically the pharmacokinetics of the medicine, how it works. So it's a very complicated, sorry, it wasn't that interesting of a thing to say. It's a very interesting and very complicated field.
No, it's not the same, like it's not something that you can just set and let pilot. There's a reason that the people who are doing this are humans who are getting paid a lot of money to do it, right? Alright, so we all know that, yes ma'am?
Oh yeah, so is that why like doctors they recommend not like putting like a specific drug out, like until it's 100% cured, like once the dosage is all gone? Is it like
For antibiotics?
yeah?
That's actually because they worry that you're going to create resistance, bacterial resistance. So just like we were talking about with cancer, and it replicates, and as you're killing it off with the chemotherapy, right, you're self-selecting for the type of cancer that's not being killed by the chemotherapy. The same thing happens with your antibiotic. So you've got a bacteria that you're treating with an antibiotic, and so you're killing off the bacteria. The ones that take the longest to die are the ones that are least sensitive to the medication. And so if you stop that medication early, you're actually self-selecting for a more resistant form of bacteria. And so that's why we ask you to take the whole medication course to make sure you're killing off even those slightly more powerful bacteria. Otherwise, you're
Creating a superbug.
Yes, creating
Yeah.
a superbug. Thank you. Better words.
Yeah. No, very good. So drugs can be administered in a variety of ways, right? We've all taken the oral pills before, right? Most people has everybody had an IV before? If you haven't, you're a very lucky person. But so intravenously in IVs where they stick a needle so that they can deliver drug directly to your vein. By your face, I'm guessing you've never had that, so you're a very
Good
lucky
for you.
man.
Yeah.
And then there's transdermally, right? This is where you put on a patch where you can absorb things through your skin. Okay? So finding the right method for medication helps to ensure the dosage is correct, and it of course helps it get into the right location, right? So for example, if you were, we might deliver an IV if we need something to be rapid, and if we need it to be maintained in an exact rate. And that's exactly what our profile, so go back to our graph, right? I like graphs, I'm an engineer, right? So we go to an IV delivery. This is what an IV looks like. We spike it up, we get the concentration where we need to be, and then they set the drip, is what they call it, right? They'll set the drip rate so that they're actually delivering the drug to you at the exact same rate that within some very minute amount that you are supposed to be essentially excreting that. So they can maintain that concentration to be exactly flat via IV. Yes, sir?
So is that that bag thing that sits by?
Correct, yeah. So it's the bag that hangs there and it drips, and that's actually, you do it in, you call it setting a drip, right?
An intravenous drip. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a problem with this though. This is the best way to do drugs, hands down, right? Or this is the best, I should say, this is the best way, let me rephrase. This is the best way to maintain drug concentration in your body.
You got
But
it on tape, folks.
There's a problem with this, in that you have to generally be at a hospital to do it, or you have to have somebody to come do a line on you, right? You have to be near a hospital. And that's not very convenient, right? Especially even if they were like at a hospital, we don't want to see Lynn pulling her little thing behind her when she's going to class, right? She's already got her books and stuff and it's way too heavy, okay? So we of course have to develop other ways to do this. And the one you guys are most common with, right? It wouldn't make sense if every time you got a headache, you had to, just hook up an IV. That would be awful, right? You probably have other problems other than just a headache. So we've gone to oral delivery. Now in oral delivery, you guys have all done this. You have to take a pill, some number of pills. The pills are of different sizes, whatever, and you have to take it every so often. So what you end up seeing is that your profile, your drug concentration profile, kind of looks like little bumps. You go in, you get it up, and then it'll start to wear off. And then you take another pill, another pill, another pill. And as long as you're doing it correctly, you can get it to maintain in that. Once people start getting off of the oral delivery schedule, you can actually start going too high, or generally you start getting too low because people forget, right? So this would be, of course, done with drugs that might not matter as much if you were to be late and miss. Like again, if your headache medicine, like let's say you forget to take Advil every 6 hours or 8 hours, it's not going to be the end of the world. Whereas a lot of the drugs that they will relegate to being IV delivery, right? If you were to take that or go too high on it, you might kill yourself, you might render it ineffective, right? So it really just boils down to what we can and can't. But of course, it doesn't make sense to have everyone having an IV of acetaminophen. Yes?
Can you build tolerance to it though? Like, you can what dictates that you can build tolerance? Like if you take a certain amount?
That's a great question for Katie.
So there are certain medications that you can develop tolerance to. Things like antibiotics, not typically, but medications like your pain medications, like opioid pain medications, absolutely you can develop a tolerance to. And so the normal amount that you would take, say when you start taking it, 5 milligrams is all you need to relieve your pain. If you're taking that on an ongoing basis, can take anywhere between a couple of weeks to a couple of months to start gaining that tolerance. It may take 10 milligrams or 15 milligrams to create that to achieve that same pain relief, and that's kind of what the tolerance is.
Is that body-based, or is there a mental component of that, though?
It is incompletely understood, and I think that it is, there is a psychological component in it, but there is a physiologic component to it as well. So for some drugs, and Andrew, maybe you go into this, that therapeutic window, that place between the NTC and the NEC can be really, really small, it can be really narrow, so you don't have a lot of operating room, a lot of wiggle room. Some drugs, your therapeutic window is really, really large. Those are things like Tylenol and ibuprofen, meds that you can take over the counter, have a really big therapeutic window, so you've got a lot of wiggle room. We actually can track we can measure the concentration of some drugs in your bloodstream and do that when we administer. There are certain antibiotics that will check the concentration before we administer the med again to make sure that we're staying within the therapeutic window. There are certain blood thinner medications that people have to check the level in their blood routinely so they know how to dose the medication.
Did that answer your question? Alright, so now, like I said, aside from like the funny part of Lynn pulling her trolley down the aisle, right, we also need to think about this from the human component, right? If we were asking Benjamin to take a pill every 7 minutes, that's probably not a very good quality of life aspect to ask Benjamin to do, right? So in that case, we may have to come up with something else, right? So what we need is, you need it to be realistic. You can't, generally, I don't know of many over-the-counter pills that ask you to take anything more than like 4 to 6 hours, just because that's kind of manageable, right? I think the ideal like pill would be like 8 to 12 hours, right? Something like that, right? And then obviously you have to think about the amount you have to give, right? You can't have Benjamin swallow a horse pill 3 times a day. Like it's not, you know, he's not going to swallow a pill this big that often, right? So you have to think about the actual delivery itself, right? So that's where the engineering comes in. It's not just the timing of the kinetics, but also thinking about how we're actually going to design our pills, right? So you have to think about the size of the pills, the shape of the pills, the type of the pills, the number of pills, and then I also want you to think about it from a marketing and distribution standpoint, right? So I might require a different amount of drug to help me not have a headache than would Lynn, right? Lynn's significantly smaller than I am, right? She might only require 1 pill, I might require 2. But then think about that. What if instead I'm saying, here's a box for a 300-pound man, here's a box for a 250-pound man, here's a box for a 200-pound man. That's completely unsellable from a logistics standpoint, right? You can't go to Freddy's and have 9 aisles worth of the right size of pills. So that's now why we're saying Andrew's going to take 2 pills and Lynn's going to take 1. So someone has to figure out what is the best size of generic pill to do. And as you guys know, you can go to the store and you can get like a 250 milligram pill and get like a 100 milligram pill, different stuff like that, right? But you still have to think about it. Should the patient take a 500 milligram tablet or 2 250s, right? It's the same amount, but why would we take 2 250s instead of a 500? Should the pills be swallowed whole or should they be chewed first, right? For kids, obviously there's a reason why we might want to have the Flintstone chewables, and that's just so they'll actually swallow it. From a fundamental standpoint, Lynn at some point in her adult life may have to take a chewable, right? Why would that be, right? And then should we use quick dissolving caps, gel caps, chewables, coated tabs? All of these factors actually affect the rate that it enters the bloodstream, and it affects how it affects that profile, right? So if we were to look at these 4 vials, right? If we were to compare the rate of drug delivery based on the design of the pill, right? So in this one vial, we have 2 500 milligrams. In the second vial, we have 3 325s, that's basically 1,000. These are all realistic pill sizes, by the way. Then we have 3 325 gel caps. And then we have 1,000 milligrams worth of crushed. Which one of these do we think will dissolve the fastest? Which one of these will enter the bloodstream the fastest? What do we think? Crushed? Why is that?
More surface area.
Yeah, and I actually don't know whether it would be the crushed or whether it would be the gels, right? It would depend on your stomach. We have run this experiment before in class. We just ran out of time this year, right? But we'll put it in vinegar because that kind of mimics your stomach, and we actually see which ones dissolve quickest. Generally, it's actually the gel caps. Those things are actually better well engineered, right? Because the idea of the gel cap is as soon as the outside dissolves, it just explodes it into your system, and then your system needs to take it up. The idea now, does anybody not know why, well, let me rephrase. Benjamin, you said the crushed. Why crushed?
Because of its greater surface area.
Greater surface area, you nailed it. That's exactly what I was looking for, right? So would you expect the 2 500s to dissolve first or the 3 325s to dissolve first?
The 3 325.
But by the same argument, right? And I would agree, right? In practice, generally you're going to, the more surface area you have, the faster it will go. right? So, rapid release dosage, right? Liquid gel, that might be like, oh man, I have a super bad headache and I need it to go now. You might take a liquid gel, or you can be like, all right, I have a minor headache, let's take just a normal pill, and then that will slow essentially the curve. And what that leads to is a difference in our concentration profile. A rapid release will get you a huge spike, but its tail is going to be pretty sharp. Whereas a controlled release is going to take longer to get there, but it's going to be significantly easier to control that. Right, so now if I were to, let me grab two of these things. Let me ask you guys a question. Let's say our therapeutic window, and this is a bad example because then you would have just killed your patient, right? But in this case, if this is our therapeutic window, the controlled release, you might only have to take that one, let's say, every 8 hours. But the rapid release, it's going to get us to where we need. It's going to get us there quicker. But how often will I have to take my rapid release? Let's just assume the...
Too often.
What's that? Too often? Roughly twice as often. Right? Now it's going to help you quicker, but your concentration will be a lot harder to control because it's going to be going up and down like this versus nice and smooth like this. Right? And that's how you guys need to think about, that's how someone in this field would have to think about doing the drug delivery. Okay, and it's really that simple. Yes, sir?
So this is the same thing where with some pills, say like don't cut them, because that increases the sort of and changes the delivery time.
Yeah, and I think it's possible that a lot of the don't cut thems might actually
Have like a separate layer.
spill out, right?
Oh well, like even just hard pills.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so I can say, for example, so I prescribe a lot of pain medicines in my practice, so that's why I'm using opioids as examples.
That's
a
why
lot.
all of our patients like her.
So in opioids, we have immediate release. So like morphine is an opioid. It's a potent pain medicine. It comes in an immediate release tablet, which you have to take about every 4 hours. It only lasts about 4 hours. They also have extended release or controlled release tablets that you can take every 12 hours. Those are formulated, it's the exact same morphine in both pill, it's just the control release tab is formulated in a way that it dissolves more slowly when you consume it. And so if you crush it or if you cut it, then that breaks down the delivery system and it basically acts like an immediate release tablet. Exactly what you were saying.
So it just changes the profile. So
Yep.
Okay, so I know this, I like to talk about stuff like this because it's stuff that you wouldn't necessarily think that engineering applies to, right? You wouldn't necessarily think day by day that the reason when you're taking aspirin it says to do that or Advil it says to do that, but there's a lot of engineering that goes behind this, and these are very real careers that engineers hold. So it is 8 o'clock, we are done early, a half hour, I'm sure we won't have any complaints. We didn't take a break, so I just want to let you guys go. If you guys would please thank Dr. Stowers, sorry. And does anybody have any additional questions before we get out of here? We'll both hang out if you have any questions. If any of you guys are considering med school, we'll both hang out. Otherwise, next week, real quick, this was our last lecture. Next week is the quiz show. So next week we're doing a Jeopardy. We'll divide you guys up into groups. We'll do Jeopardy. There are prizes. The question is, do you guys prefer prizes from Jamba Juice or Starbucks?
Jamba Juice.
That's usually overwhelmingly what I get, which is very surprising to me.
Interesting.
Last year I threw Dutch Brothers out and they still wanted Jamba Juice. So.
I don't.
Isn't there Jamba Juice?
Alright, so Jamba Juice gift cards it is. So the winning team next week will get Jamba Juice gift cards. It really will just be a Jeopardy type competition. Although we won't use Jeopardy because no one wants to get sued. So Jeopardy style competition. Okay? Any other questions real quick? Yes, sir.
So, like, how about the bridge? So, are we going to bring materials from home or just like?
So the bridge? Yeah, so the bridge competition, all you need to do is you need to buy a box of, so you need to come to class in 2 weeks with the bridge constructed.
So we're doing exactly.
No, so you need to build your bridge at home and bring it to class in 2 weeks. Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you guys.